Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Paul Harris and I'm president of the City Club's Board of Directors. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Joseph Nye Jr., Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Professor Nye comes to the City Club of Cleveland today with a distinguished, now that's a word that you're going to hear frequently during this introduction, career as a scholar, teacher, author, and government official. He received his bachelor's degree, summa cum laude, from Princeton University, and thereafter studied as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. He earned a doctorate in political science from Harvard University and joined the Harvard faculty in 1964. From 1977 to 1979, Professor Nye served as Deputy to the Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, Science, and Technology, and as Chair of the National Security Council Group on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. In recognition of that service, he was honored with the highest Department of State commendation, the Distinguished Honor Award. He later chaired the National Intelligence Council and received the Intelligence Community's Distinguished Service Medal. Subsequently, Professor Nye served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, where he received a Distinguished Service Medal. In December 1995, Professor Nye was appointed Dean of the Kennedy School, a position that he held through 2004. He has, in addition to his teaching position at Harvard, taught at schools in Geneva, Ottawa, and London. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Academy of Diplomacy and has, among other associations, served as a director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies and as the American representative on the United States Advisory Committee on Disarmament Affairs. Professor Nye has appeared on numerous television programs, including ABC's Nightline and Good Morning America, CNN's Larry King Live, CBS's Evening News, the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, as well as on Australian, British, French, Swiss, Japanese, and Korean television. Professor Nye has authored numerous books and articles. His books include Soft Power, The Means to Success in a World Politics, Understanding the International Conflict, I'm kind of messing up these names, I'm sorry, Professor, The Power Game, a Washington novel, The Powers to Lead, and then most recently, The Future of Power. In commenting on Professor Nye's latest book, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright stated, quote, Joseph Nye is America's foremost expert on the substance, diversity, uses, and abuses of power. He writes with insights that a president or secretary of state would find valuable and makes foreign policy less foreign for every reader, end quote. I am very pleased to present on behalf of the City Club of Cleveland, Joseph Nye, Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor at the Kennedy School of Government.
Thank you very much, Paul. A kind introduction, so kind my mother might believe it, not many others. But it's also nice to be back at this club in Cleveland. I spoke here some years ago, and I remember it as a very pleasant occasion, very good questions, so it was interesting to be able to come back and talk to you this time about my new book on the future of power. Basically, power is the ability to affect others to get what you want. That's pretty straightforward. And you can do it three ways. You can do it through coercion or threats, sticks. You can do it through payments, carrots. Or you can do it through attraction and persuasion in getting others to want what you want. And that's, I call, soft power. And the question we have to face in America today is, have we thought about power in all its dimensions as we cope with a world in which power is changing quite dramatically? And I'll come back to that at the end. If you look at the world of the 21st century, there are two huge power shifts going on internationally. One is what I call power transition, a shift from some states to other states. And that might be also called the shift of power from west to east. The other is power diffusion, which is the shift of power away from all states or governments to non-state actors. And let me take each of those in turn. Power transition way to understand that is to imagine a picture of the world in 1800. You'd see that more than half of the world's population was in Asia, and more than half of what the world produced was in Asia. Now, fast forward to 1900, still more than half the world's population in Asia, but only 20% of what the world produced. That's not something that happened to Asia, it's something that happened in Europe and North America, the Industrial Revolution. And what we're seeing in the 21st century, you might call the recovery of Asia, or return to normality. Somewhere around the middle of this century, Asia will be back to more than half the world's population and more than half the world's product. Sometimes people call this the rise of China. It's much more than that. It really starts with Japan, moves on to South Korea, then to some of the Southeast Asian countries like Singapore, Malaysia. Now it's very much focused in China with its 10% growth rates, but soon it'll be focused very much on India, which is now up around 8% growth. So this is a major shift. If you want, you can think of the world economy, which was once in the middle of the Atlantic, figuratively, is now going to be in the middle of the Pacific in figurative terms. And this is something we're going to have to come to terms with. But let me hold that thought for a minute and come back to it, because first I want to introduce you in more greater depth to the second great power shift that's going on, which is power diffusion. And the way to understand power diffusion is to think of what's happened in the most recent information revolution that we've gone through. Basically, the price of computing power declined 1,000-fold in the last quarter of the 20th century. That's such a big and abstract number, it's hard to wrap your mind around. One way to fix it is to think if the price of automobiles had declined as rapidly as the price of computing power, you could buy a car today for $5. Anytime the price of something goes down that dramatically, the barriers to entry go down. People who were previously priced out of the game or priced out of a market can now play because it's so cheap. Give you a couple of examples. In 1975, if you wanted to communicate simultaneously from Cleveland to Hong Kong to Johannesburg and Moscow, all at the same time, you could do it. Technically, it was possible, but it was very expensive. You needed to be a big corporation or a government to be able to afford that. Today, anybody can do the same for free by just using Skype. Or to give you another example, when I was in the Carter administration dealing with nuclear proliferation, one of our greatest secrets was that we had the capacity to take a picture of any place on Earth with 1 meter resolution. And that was extraordinarily expensive. It cost us billions and billions of dollars. Today, anybody can go on Google Earth and get an even better picture for free. This is a huge change, and as the costs of playing in the game go down, more and more people can get into the game. It doesn't mean that governments are finished. They're not. Governments are still the most powerful actors in international politics. What it does mean is the stage on which governments act is now a lot more crowded because there are a lot more players who can afford to get on the stage with the governments. Some of those players are good. Take Oxfam or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Some of them are very bad. Take Al-Qaeda. And think about the effect of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda killed more Americans in 2001 than the government of Japan did in 1941. You might think of that as the privatization of war. That's a big change. But there are other illustrations of this diffusion of power that I've referred to. Look at what's happened recently in the Middle East. If you look at the traditional wisdom or conventional wisdom about, let's say, Egypt 5 or 10 years ago, the argument was there was no middle. You had, on the one hand, the autocrat, Mubarak, And on the other hand, you had the religious extremists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and you had to support the autocrat or you'd wind up with the extremists. What we hadn't noticed was that this burgeoning of information was beginning to fill in a middle. It created the so-called Tahrir Square generation of people with secular interests. And what's more, it gave them the capacity to overcome the problems of collective action, to be able to coordinate and organize. And that, of course, were new social media like Twitter and Facebook. So you had a transformation of Egyptian politics. It doesn't produce an Egypt which is automatically a democracy. We're still in the first act of a multi-act play before we know how this is going to turn out. But it has produced a transformation of Egyptian politics. It's now at least a three-party game. You have the military, which has good old hard power, and you have the Muslim Brotherhood, which has a form of soft power based on religion, and now you have a secular middle, the Tahrir Square generation, which has a form of soft power based on a new way of looking at the world. And they're bargaining with each other. We don't know how it'll turn out, but it's certainly different from what we thought of as Egyptian politics 10 or 15 years ago. Or to give you yet another example of the transformation, of the diffusion of power in terms of how the information revolution has made non-state actors more significant, think of WikiLeaks, which you might think of as a super-empowered individual. You could have a single soldier sitting in Baghdad able to download 250,000 secret State Department cables on a Lady Gaga disc and to sneak them out and give them to WikiLeaks and have them published all around the world. Now, stealing documents isn't new. Many a spy has gone out of a building with a briefcase full of secret documents. But being able to exfiltrate a warehouse full of documents in a single disk and then transfer that around the world, that is new. So if you didn't notice, last week America's ambassador to Ecuador had to resign because of a WikiLeaks cable, which was embarrassing to the president of Ecuador. And all this because of an individual, a super-empowered individual, if you like, sitting in Baghdad. That's new. And finally, is an illustration of this diffusion of power, think about the general problem of cyber security. And I have a chapter in my book about cyber power. When we think about cybersecurity, it perhaps is best to go back to a wonderful New Yorker cartoon of some years ago, which some of you may remember. It has a picture of two dogs sitting in front of a computer. And one dog looks at the other dog and says, "Don't worry, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." And that cartoon was not only good humor, but it was also prescient, in the sense that if somebody attacks us in the cyber domain, we may not know who did it. You may have been alerted through the press to a recent event in which a worm called Stuxnet was somehow introduced into the Iranian nuclear centrifuge program and disrupted the centrifuges. It basically altered their control systems so that they spun so fast that they collapsed and destroyed themselves. That was interesting, but suppose somebody did Stuxnet back to us. Suppose, for example, electricity goes out in Cleveland in January and February. Well, you know, with frozen pipes and so forth, that could be the same effect as bombs going off. So we might want to retaliate. But where do you send the cruise missile? It could be that it was done by a hacker, could have been done by another government, could have been done by a criminal gang, could have been done by cyber terrorists. And any one of those, which was clever enough to make the electrical system go down in the eastern part of the United States,
would also be clever enough to be able to root it in such a way that it looked like it came from somewhere else. So it raises enormous problems of what is security? How do we defend ourselves? What is the strategy in this area? And frankly, at this stage, we are still thinking our way through this at such an early stage that we are to cyber today as we were to nuclear around 1950. What is offense? What is defense? What is deterrence? And what does all this mean when you don't know where you've been attacked from? So this is an example of power diffusion and how it's profoundly changing what we're going to have to deal with in the 21st century. Now let me take you back to what I put on hold, which is the question of power transition, this movement from states from west to east. Very often people say, well, you know, this is the story of American decline. It's the rise of China and the decline of the United States. I think that narrative is very unhelpful. It doesn't really explain what's going on. One problem is that we are prone to belief in decline, but we don't really quite know what it means. What is the natural life cycle of a country? There's a famous story of Horace Walpole, an 18th century British statesman, who, after Britain lost its American colonies, said, "Woe is us, we're reduced to a miserable little country like Denmark or Sardinia." Of course, he was wrong, because Britain was on the eve of its greatest century based on the Industrial Revolution. So we don't know what this next century is going to mean for the United States. It's true that Americans tend to think we're in decline, but there's nothing new about that either. That goes all the way back to the Founding Fathers. And in more recent years, in the 1950s, after Stuxnet, we thought the Soviets were 10 feet tall. And in the 1980s, the Japanese were 10 feet tall. Today, we all think the Chinese are 10 feet tall. But you know what? I don't think any of this is very convincing. If you think about the problem of using this metaphor of decline, I think it's a misleading metaphor. Not only is that we don't know what's the natural life cycle, so how do you know when decline is set in, but it mixes up two concepts which are quite different. One is absolute decline, the other is relative decline. Absolute decline is what happened to ancient Rome. Rome was an agrarian society with no productivity growth in its economy, and it eventually succumbed to internecine warfare and to onslaughts of hordes of barbarians, not to another country or empire. And it also took about 350 years to go through this whole cycle. But if you ask, is that a model for the United States today? And some people keep writing op-eds as though it were. The answer is no. America has problems, budget deficit, K-12 education, things we're going to have to deal with. But the argument that we're like ancient Rome in absolute decline just isn't right. The World Economic Forum ranks the United States as the fourth most competitive economy in the world. China, incidentally, is number 27. And if you look at new technologies of biotechnology or nanotechnology, everyone realizes the Americans are on the cutting edge here. If you look at questions like the climate for entrepreneurship, when you do surveys of this, America always comes out number one. Quality of our universities, also best in the world. We have problems, but to analogize from our problems to absolute decline of ancient Rome is a huge mistake. What's more, the rise of China can be portrayed either as the rise of the rest, these other countries getting stronger, or it can be described as relative decline. So, for example, if the U.S. starts here, and China, Brazil, and India start here, as they rise, they begin to close the gap. You can describe that as relative decline of the United States, but it might turn out that the rise of the rest will still leave the U.S. the largest, most powerful country, even if there's that relative decline. And that's what I think will happen in the 21st century. that the U.S. will remain the most powerful country for the next few decades. Now, people say, how can you say that when Goldman Sachs has predicted that China will have a larger economy than the U.S. in the 2020s? And I argue, well, being equal in size is probable. In other words, if you have a country of 1.3 billion growing at 10% a year, sooner or later they're going to be bigger than we are in terms of the total size of their economy. But equality in size of an economy is not the same as equality in composition of an economy. China has huge areas of poverty and inefficiency, and to look at the composition of an economy, you look at per capita income, not at total size of GDP. And on per capita income measures, China is not likely to catch up with the United States for another decade or two decades or more, I'd say, if then. What's more, we think of power not just in terms of economic power, but in the other dimensions I mentioned. Military power, the dimension of hard power, the United States is well ahead of China. People say China is building an aircraft carrier. Yes, but there's a long distance between that and having 11 carrier battle fleets. Or people will say, yes, but China's also increasing its soft power. President Hu Jintao told the 17th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party in 2007 that China had to invest more in its soft power. And that's smart on China's part. If you're a country which is rising in your hard power, you're likely to scare your neighbors. But if you can increase your soft power as well and become more attractive, then they're less likely to form a coalition against you. So China is investing billions and billions of dollars in efforts to increase its soft power. Confucius Institutes, the Olympics, the Shanghai Exposition, and so forth. The trouble that China has, however, is that a lot of a country's soft power comes from its civil society. And China can't let go and free its civil society because of the authoritarian nature of their system. So you had a wonderful Shanghai Expo last year, which I visited, thought was terrific, gave a very good impression of China. 70 million visitors attended. But then what does China do? It goes and locks up Liu Xiaobo and refuses to let him attend the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony and essentially shoots itself in its foot. It undercuts that soft power that had been trying to build up. So it's not too surprising that when you look at a recent poll taken by the BBC, the United States is well ahead of China in soft power and is probably likely to remain that way until China changes the nature of its political system, which I don't expect will happen very soon. So if you look at this picture of the rise of China as part of the recovery of Asia, and you look at this question that the Americans may have less of a gap between us and others, but that's not absolute decline, I think it is implausible to say that we're going to be passed by China anytime soon. Now, why is this important? It's not important because power is something special. I mean, power is like calories in your diet. Too few and you expire, too much and you become obese. What's important is have a realistic sense of power relations. And there is a proposition about international politics that says when one country thinks that it's rising and another country thinks that it's declining, that can be the source of great conflict. This goes all the way back to the Peloponnesian War, in which the Greek city-state system tore itself apart. And the famous chronicler of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides, said it was basically caused by the rise in the power of Athens and the fear that created in Sparta. And similarly, people say World War I, in which the European state system tore itself apart and ended Europe's dominance of world politics, was caused by the rise in the power of Germany and the fear that created in Britain. And some go on and take the next step and say, and the 21st century will see an equivalent conflict because of the rise in the power of China and the fear that's creating in the United States. I think this is bad history and bad analysis. For one thing, it's worth remembering that Germany had passed Britain by 1900. if you agree with what I said earlier, and the facts and figures for it are in my book, China's not about to pass the United States, at least for a couple of decades. That means we have time to manage this relationship. We don't have to be too fearful. We can, in fact, work on this problem to create incentives that shape the international environment for China. And when they behave cooperatively, they benefit from it. When they don't, they pay a price. That's important that we avoid that very dangerous situation in which the belief in the inevitability of conflict becomes itself the cause of a conflict. So can we manage this rise of China? I think the answer to that is yes, in the sense of the traditional transition of power. But there's another reason why we're going to need to work cooperatively, which goes back to the other topic, the other great power shift I mentioned, the diffusion of power. Because many things are changing in such a way that we are going to need the cooperation of China and others to deal with them. To summarize this, let me invite you to think of the distribution of power in the 21st century as analogous to a three-dimensional chessboard in which you play horizontally and vertically at the same time. On the top board of this three-dimensional game, the board of military relations among states, the United States is the world's only superpower. We're the only country that can project military power globally. And if you look at world military expenditures, we're nearly half of all world military expenditures. Very hard for other countries to balance our power in the traditional 19th century terms. But if you go to the second board of economic relations among states, the world is multipolar. There are a number of major powers who can balance us in that area. For example, economics is the area where the European Union can act as an entity. And when it does, the economy of Europe is still larger than the economy of the United States. And in addition, you have, of course, China, Japan, Brazil, India, and others who essentially can help to balance our power. But now let me take you down to the bottom board of this three-dimensional game, the board of transnational relations, things that cross borders outside the control of governments. And this is where power diffusion and non-state actors come in. Think of international criminal groups. Think of transfers of financial resources that are larger than the budgets of many countries. Think of cyber transfers and flows. Think of terrorism. Think of impersonal processes like climate change or pandemics. It makes no sense at all to call this unipolar or multipolar. Power is chaotically distributed on this bottom board. And the only way in which we can cope with these new types of challenges of the 21st century is by working with others. And what that means is we're going to have to use our soft power to develop networks and institutions to get the cooperation we need to deal with some of these problems. They can't be solved alone, and they can't be solved by military means. Where do you send the cruise missile to stop climate change or to enhance financial flows? Basically, we in the United States are going to have to realize that while we will likely remain the largest power, we're going to have to change the way we approach many of the issues that we face as a result of these big power shifts in the century. We're going to have to learn that if you play a three-dimensional chess game and you focus on one board only, you're going to lose. We're going to have to learn that the traditional view of power, which was the mark of a great power, was the ability to prevail in war. In an information age, it's not just whose army wins, it's also whose story wins. And we're going to have to think of power in a much more subtle way than we have in the past. There's some danger that the United States is like one of my grandsons who, when he had a new hammer, everything in the world was a nail. And because we're so strong on this top board, there's a great danger that we think that gives us the capacity to deal with these new problems that are coming out of this bottom board. Now, let me not leave you with the impression that military power is unimportant. I was, after all, an Assistant Secretary of Defense, and I greatly admire our capacity in this area. But being important is not being sufficient. And we, as a people, are going to have to learn to talk and think about power in a much more refined way than we have in the past. It's very easy to stand up as a politician and recruit money for a defense budget with $700 billion. Notice that last week, out of a $50 billion State Department budget, Congress cut $8 billion right out of our soft power. This is not the way to think about the 21st century. And even though we do have a serious budget deficit problem and have to deal with it, the contribution of $8 billion to reducing our budget deficit is literally a drop in an ocean. And in the process of pretending that we were doing something about that, we managed to do something quite damaging to our foreign policy for the nature of the century we're entering. So we as Americans are going to have to think in a much more sophisticated way about what is power if we're going to cope with these two great power shifts of the century, power transition and power diffusion. And that's basically why I wrote this book. So thank you very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday forum featuring Joseph Nye, Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. We'll return to our speaker momentarily for our traditional City Club questions. We'd ask you to start formulating your questions now, and also respectfully ask that you keep them short and to the point so we can get as many questions in as possible. Members and guests alike are welcome to attend City Club forums, and we certainly hope that everyone listening will join the City Club and become active in our ongoing civic dialogue. We welcome all of you here and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS IdeaStream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC, and our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. We are very pleased to welcome guests today at tables hosted by the law firm Baker & Hostetler and City Year. Thank you for joining us today. Today's program is the annual Richard W. and Patricia R. Pogue Endowed Forum. Joining us at the head table today are Dick and Patricia Pogue. Will you please stand and be recognized? And thank the two of you for your outstanding support of the City Club. We're also pleased to welcome students who are here as part of the City Club student program. Participation of these students is made possible by a generous grant from the Fred E. Scholl Foundation, Bernard L. Carr, Chairman. With us today are students from Elyria High School. Will the students please stand and be recognized? And thank you for joining us today. Now we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are City Club Marketing and Membership Manager Heather Sikora and Development Assistant Lucille Barbati. First question, please.
Professor Nye, I think your message is very appropriate, and I was particularly interested in your final comments about cutting the State Department budget, because I'm very active in international exchange programs, which are an example of building soft power. Recently, we hosted a delegation here in Cleveland from South Korea, which was made up almost 6 people, almost 100% of them were defectors from North Korea. Those people believe in their heart that at some point there'll be a unification of that peninsula. Give me an example of how soft power might help that happen. They had no idea how it was going to happen, but they believed fervently. They all worked with refugees, frankly, from North Korea, too.
Well, I think the attractiveness of the idea of a unified Korea will eventually lead to a unified Korea,
as it once did to a unified Germany. But the timing of it is very hard to predict. The Kim Jong-il regime is on its way to becoming what seems to be an oxymoron, which is a communist monarchy. they have showed this will be 3 generations if they pass power to the son, Kim Il-sung. And the idea of trying to change Korea through soft power is implausible in the short term. Basically, the only way you can try to have any leverage on North Korea is if the Chinese were willing to use the food and fuel they provide as a form of hard power to press the Koreans. But the Chinese are so afraid of chaos on their borders, of a Korea that implodes, that it has given North Korea what I call in my book the power of weakness. Keynes in the 1930s once observed that if you owe a bank £1,000, the bank has you in its power. But if you owe the bank £1 billion, you have the bank in your power. And North Korea has that kind of power over China. So even though China could, in principle, cut off food and fuel to North Korea, they won't. And that means it's going to be a longer and slower process. But I hope that at some point the idea of a unified Korea will prevail.
You've captivated us because of the size and scope of the ideas you put forth. I want to ask if you can bring it down to a day-to-day level and tell us what ways are we going to see this manifested in our day-to-day level, perhaps in our local politics or in our national politics, perhaps just simply in the way we get fads and ideas that take course and power.
Well, let me give you a couple of examples, which is if you think about the cyber security problems, that affects all of us. I mean, if the lights go out in Cleveland, that's going to affect everybody. But it's also interesting in the way it changes our politics. There's less time to think now. I was talking to a congressman who is at the Harvard Kennedy School now, who has just been defeated, and he said, I said at a rally when, or a town hall, when somebody said, I'm so scared of the world now, and he said, why? And he said, Glenn Beck has told me that. And he said, well, you know, you can always turn off Glenn Beck. He said, the interesting thing is that was immediately on YouTube, and it cost him very dearly in parts of his constituency. That's a type of politics now in which there's less time for reflection, less time for honest discussion. That affects us all on our daily lives. But let me mention something else which is a controversial and difficult subject, which is the way we approach immigration. We have a lot of problems in this country now about immigration, and there are lots of changes that could be done to improve our immigration law. George W. Bush, to his credit, made some very good suggestions on improving our immigration law. But it's a taboo subject now. And yet, if you think about immigration, in the long run, we are a country of immigrants, and that's a source of our strength. In the long term, the United States is the only rich country which is going to hold its position in the world demographic tables by 2050. Today, the ranking of countries is China, India, U.S. In 2050, it will be India, China, U.S. Europe, Japan, Russia are all losing population. One of the reasons we're holding our own is because we're open to immigrants. And as Lee Kuan Yew, who's a very wise man from Singapore, former Prime Minister of Singapore, said to me once, he said, you know, I asked him when we were having lunch, will the Chinese pass us? He said, well, the Chinese are going to get close, but they're not going to pass you. So because while China can draw on a talent pool of 1.3 billion people, the United States can draw on a talent pool of 7 billion people. And what's more, can take those people and recombine them in a diversity which makes them far more creative than you get from ethnic Han nationalism. So in terms of how does this affect us day to day, I would say be careful about succumbing to the current wave of anti-immigrant feeling.
Professor Nye. Very, very provocative and interesting presentation. How would you apply your concepts of power to the relationships between and among state and local governments?
Well, you're going to see that, and this is beyond just state and local, but in general, you're going to see that more and more in an information age depends on networks rather than hierarchies. And that means that in a hierarchy, you can give commands. In networked relationships, you're going to have to attract and persuade. You're going to have to use more soft power. So in an information age, we have to realize that something that Dwight Eisenhower said quite well. Remember, Eisenhower was both a general and a president. He said, to give a command in a hierarchy, anybody can do that. To get others to do something because they want to do it for you, that's hard. And so as I think of this relationship of levels of government, federal, state, local, the argument that, well, one is above the other, they give orders to the other, a lot more is going to have to be done in cooperative networks. Not only cooperative networks of levels of government, but also cooperative networks of public and private entities within communities. So I think we have to reframe the way we think about leadership from just command and control to thinking about how you organize networks of attraction and cooperation. And I think that's true, as I suggested in my talk, at the global level. It's also true at the local level.
Professor Nye, thank you very much for being here. I didn't hear you refer at all to what I choose to call the Arab lands, which at one time, centuries ago, were pretty much the center of the world. Would you comment on their decline and what you see as their future?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have, I mean, I mentioned briefly politics in Egypt, but you're right, I didn't think of or describe the Arab countries as a whole. We're going through a very interesting period now that some people call the Arab Spring. It's worth remembering, though, that Arab and Muslim are not the same. Arabs are a small minority of Muslims. The biggest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia, and there are more Muslims in South Asia than there are in the Arab countries. But because of Muslim civilization growing very much out of Arab culture, there is an identity at one level across everything from Morocco to Indonesia. But right now there is a tremendous change going on across North Africa and now affecting the Persian Gulf as well. Many see this as a reversal of a period in which there was a feeling of decline in Arab countries and a feeling of indignity. In fact, there was a wonderful report written for the United Nations Development Program about 8 years ago called the Arab Human Development Report, written by Arabs about Arab countries. And it said, if you look at what's going on in our countries, we don't translate many books into Arabic. We don't have a production of scientific articles. Our trade is smaller than the trade of one small European country. And the role of women is, we're wasting half of our human resources. So there are Arabs who were already perceiving this. And that's partly what's behind this, what I call the Tahrir Square generation. A new, younger group of people who want to recover dignity and modernity for Arabs. And this is playing out differently in different countries. I mean, even though at one level, superficially, there's been a contagion that starts in Tunisia and sweeps across the region, but it comes out in different forms in different countries. There may be some hope in, let's say, Tunisia and Egypt that you can put together a better political system. In heavily tribalized societies like Libya and Yemen, it may be much harder. But nonetheless, the change is going on. Whether it will be for the better or for the worse, it depends on each country, and also a lot of things that we have not yet seen.
What should schools be doing to prepare students for the future, and what do you think Congress and Obama should be doing to amend the flaws of No Child Left Behind?
Well, I think that one of the most important things for schools to be doing now is to make sure that American young people realize that we're part of a much larger world. We can't cut ourselves off. We can't isolate ourselves. And that means that it's not enough just to study American history, though that's tremendously important. You have to understand other cultures. Why do Arabs, for example, as the last question suggested, see the world differently than we do? Why, when we talk about a freedom of agenda, do they sometimes think we're hypocritical because we don't see it through their eyes? How will China see the world as China grows more powerful and as we have to work with Chinese? So I would say, if you don't want to spend the effort and time learning Arabic or Mandarin, which I hope more students will, at least make sure that students in their social studies classes and geography classes have a much better appreciation that this is a world that is shrinking. If electrons can cross borders in milliseconds and do us damage or bring ideas which can do us good, we've got to use our school system to prepare people for that. As for the No Child Left Behind Act, I'm really not enough of an expert on that to give you a sensible answer. But what I do know is that we're going to have to put a lot more resources and efforts into the quality of our K-12 education than we're doing now.
My question is about India and its viability in the future. I understand that of the 1 billion people that live in the country, they're very ethnically diverse, and there's other problems in that area. But educationally, only 3 in 100 Indians qualify for jobs. They're unemployable. As a matter of fact, many companies in India are outsourcing to the Philippines and Guatemala. I think it's kind of strange with a county with that kind of a workforce would have to outsource. Only 2 of their universities are in the top 500 in the world. Just some comments on whether or not this stability with the majority of the unemployed in India are under the age of 25, very similar to Tunisia and Egypt and Libya, whether there's a real chance of some instability between Pakistan, India, or internally in those 2 countries.
Well, your description of India's problems is correct. India has a huge problem, which is it wastes an awful lot of its human resources. The literacy rate in India is about 2/3. Literacy rate in China is about 95%. And if you look at women's literacy in India, it's even worse. So India is going to have to overcome those problems to be able to fill the role which I think it can fill by 2050. There has been, though, a remarkable change in India in the last 2 decades. It used to be that India was growing at about 1 or 2% a year. And sometimes people attributed this to religion and culture. They said this is the Hindu rate of growth. In the 1990s, when the Indian government began to deregulate its heavy hand that was holding back entrepreneurship in India, you suddenly saw growth rates spurt up. In the last couple of years, India has been growing 7 and 8%, which is very impressive. And that lays the basis for the kinds of change that India needs. It turns out that the problem for India was not the Hindu rate of growth, it was the London School of Economics rate of growth, which was a socialist view of government control of the economy, which was imported to India by the early Indian nationalists who had studied in London. But I think they're overcoming that. The question is whether they're overcoming it rapidly enough. I was in Delhi in January and met with the head of the Indian Planning Commission, among other ministers, and the Prime Minister and Finance Minister and other Indian ministers. At the top, they're aware of this, but they're having a hard time doing it as quickly as they need to. So you're right to be concerned, but again, if you take a longer perspective and measure their progress since, let's say, 1990, the trajectory has been pretty impressive.
Professor Nye, power has tended to be framed in governmental terms, nation-state terms, as the power to act against another force. But you've vividly described a world in which power is diffusing to non-governmental entities. And I ask if you would address the slightly novel concept of species power. Not so much power against another species, that's not really on the docket here, but the power of our species to come closer to fulfilling its potential.
Well, it's an interesting point, and let me preface it by saying that we often think of power as power over others. But if you think about what I said at the end of my talk, that power is the ability to get the outcomes you want, sometimes you have to get it with others. So there may still be zero-sum power over others. That is going to be around as long as humans are humans, speaking of species. But we're also going to have to learn that to get what we want, sometimes we're going to have to work with others. I think that's also by analogy, one can adapt that to our relation to the planet. I mean, we have always had the view that we had power over nature. It was all there for the taking. We took it. We redesigned the planet. We rebuilt it. We used the resources, and to good avail. But I think we're now becoming a little bit more aware of finite limits. And we're going to have to realize that we're going to have to think of power with natural forces. It's interesting if you think about climate change. The one area where China has passed the United States as a superpower is in production of carbon dioxide. China is a CO2 superpower. And they're building a new coal-fired plant every week. And you can say, the Chinese will say, but that's our sovereign right. This coal is within our territory. But you know what? Doesn't matter where the CO2 comes from. From Mother Nature's point of view, it's all CO2. It all has the effect of warming. It all tends not merely to melt polar ice caps, but also to release methane from the Arctic tundra, which is even more dangerous. And the Chinese are just now beginning to realize that instead of approaching this as a question which is one group of humans versus another, very often in the past, Chinese and Indians and others say, you put that CO2 up there when you were having your industrial revolution, now it's our turn to put ours up while we're having ours. And the answer to that is, excuse me, Mother Nature doesn't care who put it there. And if you put it up there and you lose the Himalayan ice caps, which produce the rivers that irrigate your country and affect the monsoons for India as well, we'll all suffer. But you'll suffer as much or more than we will. So getting an ethic in which we think about species working with nature, not just against nature, I think is something that we're probably going to slowly have to come to in the 21st century.
Professor Nye, as the United States continues to grapple with its response to the shifting sands of political upheaval in the Middle East, should we be thinking about it in terms of the exercise of soft power or hard power or smart power? Mm-hmm. And then what does that exercise of power look like in its implementation?
Well, it's an interesting question because if you look at the problems that President Obama faced when this revolution started in Egypt, he had to deal with the military. He had certain hard power goals like keeping peace with Israel, balancing Iranian power, and so forth. So you couldn't ignore them. On the other hand, if you placed all your chips on Mubarak and the military, and you ignored these people in Tahrir Square, you're going to lose the next generation. So you needed the soft power of a narrative about democracy and change to appeal to the Tahrir Square generation, at the same time that you needed to keep your military assistance to the Egyptian army for the hard power goals you have. That is like walking a tightrope, to do both those things simultaneously. When you're walking a tightrope, particularly when you're new at it, you tend to wobble. And so we've often wobbled as we're going through this between how we use our hard and soft power. So far, we haven't fallen off. And we'll have to hope that that continues. But by and large, I think combining our hard and soft power, which means combining our military presence, but with a narrative of democracy and reform and change, is probably the way we're going to have to cope with a very complex situation. And it'll play out, as I said earlier, differently in different countries.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to a Friday forum featuring Joseph Nye, Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor at the Kennedy School of Government. Thank you very much, Professor Nye. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.